another one of the houses of this period. This was dated 1897 and is called the Barn, which is near Exmouth in the west of England, and is done by a man named Pryor, E.S. Pryor, who was not as good as Boise, I think, but similar. Stone, grouped windows. It has this curious open aspect one, and these are people of the Victorian Society who are looking at this building on one of our tours back some years ago. Well, that's that, and then what else do we have? We have another house. Just to show you, Lutyens, who continued to practice architecture and was more famous throughout the rest of his life than Boise, gave up the practice of architecture. So he just retired into his shell. And that's somewhat true of the Scotch architect Mackintosh, who kind of just quit doing it and did watercolors for the long period of his life. There was something fatal about this generation, except Lutyens, of course, swept everything away. That is his house of 1899 called Orchards, and there were many others. Now here's a house, or not a house. This is an example, and a fairly rare example too, of the arts and crafts movement, especially by Boise, and I'm going to show you some relation to something here. This is a building in Chiswick, which is really a suburb of London, and it was built for a carpet factory. Well, there's the arts and crafts, obviously artistic carpets are made. It's now part of the municipal offices of the town of Chiswick. And there, look at the side. It's a fantastic window. Metal frame window. White brick. And these structural buttons. And then, I don't know whether those windows have any practical purpose or not, but they are certainly typical. The big blue area goes up above the roof line and then has a sort of scallop top, fiber, and these things come up and they have a little lid, like a mortar board sitting on the top of it. This is, I think it's a marvelous building. I admire it greatly. And I only a couple of years ago, well, hardly even that, I discovered that there was in Portland a building which was imitating it. It's incredible, absolutely incredible that it should be there. And that building is about 1905. This building is dated 1917. One wouldn't otherwise be able to probably guess it. And I don't know the architect. It's a job for somebody to find out. It is one of the lodge buildings. It is called the Orient Lodge of the IOOF, the Independent Order of Lodge Clubs. And this is on the east side in Portland. And the color of it is a little bit extreme. I wonder if it really was that color to begin with. But you couldn't imagine doing that building without that. So whoever did it had to see, I can tell you how he saw it, because that building was published in The Studio, which was one of the most widespread popular magazines to show designs of this new movement in decoration and in architecture. Fortunately, we have a file of The Studio in the library, and I don't know, somebody saw that and used it for this, and it is, of course, a curiosity. Must admit to find it important. You can't say it's very original, but there's sort of a bold idea, so use it like that. There, you see the difference, though, between imitation and the real thing. This is wax and Boise, and there are some, these are dark, glazed black bricks. The rest of it is white brick. Very interesting building, I think, mostly. Well, that's about all I'm going to do with Boise. And now I'm turning to, there's much more could be said, but I could go on with the rest of the course on the arts and crafts, but I won't. And so we'll eventually get over to America again. But in the meantime, it's perhaps worthwhile noting that although we will have considerable influence from the English arts and crafts movement in this country and in Oregon, there perhaps is hardly any influence from the one really important phase of the Art Nouveau, which was invented really by one man, in Brussels in 1893 by the man Victor Horton, who was later made a baron of the Belgian kingdom. And this is the house of the little here, you see it over there, Lily House. It is a very significant house in the history of architecture. It is that really can hardly be overlooked. This is at the, it's always known as the number 12, the Rue de Turin. It is actually the street has been changed, so it is not any longer the Rue de Turin. But it is, of course, Baron Horton. It is the first to be called Art Nouveau, and it's in many ways it has some interesting interiors to it. But it's in conventional space in row house, but it is stone, and the stone is given this sort of supple movement to it. You can see it over here again. So you see how it blends into these others. More or less contemporary, I should assume, but not really distinguished. But he did quite a few out of that. And then it has, you see, this bay. And the bay is a sort of column that having their roots down there and catch the base. And the foliage reaches up. This is metal. And then there's a great deal of metal up here in this high bay, and it lacks sort of triangle-like grill, and at the top is another one. And inside, there's a very well-known, all the books have illustrations of it, stairway, and the studio up the top with skylights, which are sort of curvilinear as well. I simply am not going to show you all that. This is Paris. And of course, not only, after all, Belgium is a small country, but Brussels is very influential. Brussels was quite a center of art exhibitions at the end of the 19th century. In Paris, the principal architect was a man of the Art Nouveau, was a man named Hector Guimard. And he designed, among other things, the stations for the metro, which was the new underground railway system of Paris in the late 19th century. And I'll show you on this side one of the typical entrances to the Paris metro. And it's very, because the lettering, that's Art Nouveau, that lettering, and that's the Metropolitan. And this is the entrance to the station at the Cité, which is, you can see here. It's on the Ile de la Cité, and very close, in fact, to Notre Dame. And this is just a stair troop down. It's surrounded by a stone bridge, and then there's a bronze railing. And notice there also that Baron Horton's house has this kind of thing, reaching down and grabbing things, organic. But organic perhaps in a way that is maybe a little too obviously light, growing plants. And then this is one of the rather rare survivors of an entrance which is covered. And this is out of the edge of town, and this is the Metropolitan at the Place Dauphine. And there is the pedestrians enter here to go down to the lighting fixtures. Well, there's a lighting fixture there, up above. And the lighting fixtures that were designed by Guimard, that really, they have violet bud forms. Now that may seem, the fragility of a violet seems hardly capable of being expressed in the wrought iron of these things. And yet that is typical of it. And then this is the detail of the railing, just to show you what it looks like closer up. This is a house by Guimard, and this is the Rue de la Fontaine of 1897, and here is a detail of the house, another one, by Roth. That's Guimard, and this Roth is in the Avenue Rapp of 1901. A jumble in some ways, and yet full of all this stuff. And in fact, if I get to here, I have a detail of that doorway. And you see, it is a big mount-like thing. So, we get it all switched again. I think this is La Fontaine, the Rue de La Fontaine. And this, maybe I'll get the entrance to this in a minute. The light is so bad up in my office now, I can't tell what's going on. There, this is the other one. This is the entrance. It's a much overexposed slide, but it shows you what I wanted to show you. This kind of thing with a figure. It looks like a figure of the image of France, with a Phrygian cap, and this sort of plasticity of the stonework. Well, that's the doorway to the one in the Avenue Roth. Well, that is the Art Nouveau. And then you have in Vienna the Secession at the same time. And the principal architect of the Secession was Otto Wagner. I have talked at length about Otto Wagner in other occasions, but I'll just show you one, well actually two buildings that are just side by side of 1898 in the street called the Linker Bienenzeile. And the one on the left is called the Majolica House because it is covered with a series of tile patterns with flowers going all over it. Actually quite nice in the lower part too, in the nicely articulated metalwork, shops, balcony, and then apartments above. And next to it, you see coming up there, comes this is another one, this is next to it, and it's another treatment. It still is in this sort of exuberant, and very often one feels very much like jewelry design. For instance, that kind of ornament from the architecture there might make a pendant. In fact, it might seem more suitable. But he said, there are the two houses. This one is in relief. I think that is golden tile, not otherwise. And that is, of course, the tile of it gives its name, Majolica, and it is that floral pattern house. Well, that is Vienna. That's called the Secession. They call themselves the Secession. Now, of course, in Spain, on the side of Western Europe, Gaudí was at work, and Gaudí has so much that I can show you. I'll show you one building, one apartment house, shop below. This is the Casablanca, and this photograph shows it has this kind of growth-like treatment. This is stone, but it's quite, and this is like the growing up, and it also looks somewhat like bones, like ancient bones dug up and put together. Some ancient prehistoric bones there. The Casablanca, here's a detail of it. And you see, the plan of the house is really very simple. It's a rectangle, and the only things that break it up are some little bay windows here and there. But it gives you a great animation over it with this surface. And it's this is all stonework. It looks as though it were made out of plastic stuff that is stone. And then this is a kind of mosaic of tile, which is intended deliberately to look like the foam of the sea. Barcelona is the principal Spanish seaport, and it's related to the mountain behind, like Montserrat, to come up the top, and to the sea. Gaudí, of course, is the world apart, but that is the Spanish, and it's the best example I'm going to show you of the Spanish New Art movement. The Italians had what they called the Stile Floreale, and that they named it quite literally. It's the floral style. It's their version of the New Art movement. And this is an apartment house in Milano, which dates from 1907, called the Albergo Corso, and there are two views, you know, because I've got the color right. And here you can see something akin to Gaudí, but not really like Gaudí. Not like any of it. They're slightly different, and once you're familiar with it, you always recognize it as the Italian form. The offices now, this says some insurance company there, and there's this tendency to have things sort of not quite literally growing, but very nearly so, as they spread from these brackets upward to the part of the building. Well, as a matter of fact, in 1902, the Italians had an exhibition in an international exhibition in Torino, and that really was a field day for the Art Nouveau. Of all countries, except for the new art of all areas, appeared in that. Here is an example from the Netherlands. This is the American Hotel in Amsterdam. It used to be a favorite hotel of mine when I was going to Europe. I stayed there a number of times. Built in 1898 to 1901. And the architect was a man named Kromhout. And American Hotel. It was called American, perhaps because it had the amenities of an American hotel. But also, I think a little bit, it has some influence kind of from the American architecture of Richardson, and that's it's yellow bricks, and the Duchess of the brick. And it had a cafe. This is the square in front of the Ladies' Plain, and right next door is the Opera House and the canal on that side. Really remarkably good. It really was, you know, the right last word in hotel. But it's also in the comfort. As the French call it, le confort moderne, when you have indoor plumbing and all that kind of thing. But at any rate, there's the comfort, as you see, it says the American hotel. They had good food too in the cafe. It should be rather for a necessary. Alas, I don't know, I suppose I'll ever get back there again. Here are two examples of the same kind of movement in Switzerland, somewhat more dur, perhaps proper, in Zurich, very Germanic. And I don't have any particular, I don't have the fact though that they date from this period, as you see here, in apartment houses in Zurich. Just one example from northern Germany. This is a house, and it ties in partly to some of the other things we've been doing. This is a house in Berlin, in Nikolassee, which is sort of a western suburb. It's in West Berlin, and it was built in 1978 by the architect Hermann Luthesius. I particularly want to show it because he also wrote about the English arts and crafts movement, and that thing, Das Englische Landhaus, a very influential book in which he visited England. He was a cultural attaché at the German embassy in London, and then he went to the church and published it. And this house here in the western suburbs of Nikolassee is very English, yet it wouldn't be mistaken for an English building. It is quite like the effect of the arts and crafts, but it is Germanic in its general overall weightiness. I guess that's the best way I could put it, that it comes up like that. On the left, two houses in Kankakee, Illinois, of 1900. One on the left is the Hickok's house, and one on the right is the Bradley house. I don't think there's anything that can be found quite that early in the south of California. Well, you notice that they're both stucco, and of course they're wood construction. They have rather large overhanging roof forms, and the roof forms coming out on the end with the top of the gable extending beyond the eaves. That perhaps is also slightly Japanese, but altogether it doesn't look much like a Japanese house. If he does it right, was of course much interested in Japanese things, especially as he saw them through Japanese prints. It's also true that the Ward Lewis house of 1902 might have some suggestions for the bungalow style. This is Highland Park, and this is by right, of course, well known to all of them, I suspect. Again, it's 2 stories throughout, but the emphasis seems to be on relatively low spread. And of course, that a real bungalow would be like that, but then generally speaking, they are not real bungalows. Now, among the examples that I can find a slide of, this is a house, a studio house for Charles Green in Pasadena of 1901, by Green and Green, and Green and Green perhaps almost solely invented the California bungalow. Other people did some too, but this is one of the typical examples. I think the trees in the way. That's so well, what overhanging roof? I haven't seen this house. I guess it's still standing. And it just said overhanging roof. Not quite counts here as a sort of bungalow style. John Galen Howard, who was then, in fact, he was the founder of the School of Architecture at Berkeley, and this is his own house of the beginning of the century, of about the same time. This house, like the others, is more than one story, has heavy overhanging roof form, and even a tower. He also designed the old School of Architecture at Berkeley, which I didn't bring a slide in to show you, but which was in a kind of bungalow mode. Here is Maybank in Berkeley, doing a house that it's called the Allen House, and it's dated between 1900 and 1906. Now, there also is something suggestive of the Swiss chalet in the character of the roof. But you notice there's the angular fall up here and the wide overhang, and of course it is 3 stories high, hardly in essence a real bungalow. 2 of the more elaborate examples by Green and Green date from 1907 and 1909. They're both in Pasadena, the Blacker House on the left and the Gamble House on the right. Both of them are very much reproduced, very well known, and they are bungalow style, though obviously not in the sense of one-story bungalow. A lot of open sort of lattice work, but fairly heavy timbering. And there again, there is some suggestion in the details, which I don't have time to go into, of inspiration from Japan. Now that kind of thing leads to bungalow. But in addition, in getting this whole mode started, one has to recognize the work of the craftsman group, the craftsman school, which was largely done by Gustav Stickley, who was influenced by Elbert Hubbard. You probably know of Elbert Hubbard. Some of your family may have had some of those myth-covered books of Elbert Hubbard. The Roy Crofters, what he developed. And he had a very influential word for, I think, for middle-class Americans who wanted to do the right thing in literature, art, who didn't, they were like the patrons of Chautauqua, and they were not highbrow. I think that's what it is recognized. And Mr. Stickley seems to have absorbed that, the whole character of that. He published a magazine called The Craftsman, very interesting magazine. And it is somewhat parallel as an American magazine to the publication of The Studio in England, but The Studio was rather more eclectic. The Craftsman style I can illustrate by showing you one house designed by Gustav Stickley, which was published in The Craftsman in 1908. There are only 6 slides of it. And of course, it is not obviously a bungalow in the sense of being a one-story house. It is rather compact, solid block, with, as you can see, mixtures of brick, actually just stone, and wood, and rather sort of loose overhang. There's a pergola on the back side there, and it's variety of portions. The house has rather freely developed window forms so that you can have group windows, and group windows occur very often. And once you get this idea, you can see we're going to see the craftsman type. That was the porch of the property. sort of chunky, boxy, heavy in a way. And the craftsman influence was so widespread, by plenty of examples right here in Eugene. Although I don't think you'll find anything that's quite like this, that's true. But the craftsman's house will be pretty big. And I will classify the present chancellor's house as basically a craftsman's house. So people think, but I think that's basically what it is. So you see the combination of rather roughly treated structure, rather overhanging roof form, and using drawings to sort of blend the house into the landscape, though the shape of the house, as we see in the plan, is in fact very compact, very different. See, this is the, I love the plans reversed, I guess. This is the ground floor, the second floor, and you see the end of which we're just looking at. You come in and you see the perfect rectangle. The kitchen is projecting out, which then is just the deck above. You come into the hall, and notice some of the details. There's a seat on one side. They were great for built-in seats. And the bungalow, and the dining room, and then it's built-in sideboard, pantry, and the passage, the living room, and the fireplace. So they don't have fireplaces in every room. There's a seat, there's a landing, there's a seat stairway, and a seat back there. At the end of the passage, then there's a terrace in the back, and the first floor, towards the front. The stair goes up several turns, and that brings us up to the second floor. And sure enough, we're retired, we got a seat up there. So he's got a seat everywhere. And then the bedroom, the sunroom, a lot of windows, other bedrooms here and here, and a bathroom. Well, a good bathroom, because this is the period when, certainly, a bath is an essential part of any well-thought-out house. That would be typical. But it's a very good, comfortable plan, and that is the kind of thing that I love. There's some views of the inside. There you see a view of the billiard room on the third floor, which I didn't have a plan of the craftsman house. And up there is a view of the hall and stairway with a glimpse of the dining room at the right. And you see, there's a seat. And sort of architecturally built-in umbrella thing. The furniture period is very rectangular and very, not too heavy, but not spindly at all. And notice that the beams are used to define the space, and of course up here under the roof. And there's a pendant light that's familiar to me. There would be probably colored glass on top of it. That is craftsman's house. Remember, that's 1980. Now, it's hard to pick up a direct line from that. We should have more examples of it, which I don't. But here on the other side is Elvis Lawrence's own house in Portland, which was built in 1967, and it was built as a double house. And it's hard to photograph. It's dark there, and maybe I'll get detail. Now, this is a kind of combination of craftsman and arts and crafts characters. This is the porch, any arts and crafts, a very definite kind of craft, like in its projecting form. It ran along lengthwise, and it really was two houses. Well, here, that dates from 1967, just after he came to Orient, to settle. He was on his way to California, but he was waylaid in Portland. This is a drawing for the George W. Collins house, which was drawn and dated 1907 by A.E. Doyle. And Doyle was just beginning his independent career, yet disappeared. And he, of course, is one of the major architects. Something similar. They had a better view of this, you see it. And here is a photograph of the Collins house. Then, well, the other one is too. Doyle's own house. So then, well, that, of course, suggests arts and crafts, craftsmen, and like a big bungalow. But it doesn't have the green bungalow features which were to come in more commonly later on. A very nice drawing by Doyle, as you see it on his desk. He signed in 1970. Well, now I'm going to show you some illustrations from a publication called Fenner Holmes. It doesn't have that date, but probably was not as early as these houses, probably within the teens of the century. And as is so typical, to give them, they're all bungalows practically, without any question, and they're more typical than the others, and he gives them names, like I mentioned before, that if you're publishing a design, or actually a photograph of a building, some of them are photographs, some are drawings, that you give it a name. The name doesn't have anything to do with the style. But the one on the left is called the Florida, for reasons that no one would ever be able to discover now. And this one, of all things, is called the Willamette. That's what it is, Willamette Valley, I guess. You see, first of all, notice some of the things. The tapered column, and they're a river boulders thing. And rather wide is not as wide, not like that. Very flat river. And of course, that's suitable for a long time. Very wide overhang. But you notice that those features are going to appear over and over again. Wherever you're getting this style. This was truly popular American style, and there's no question what that is. Above this one too. This is more traditional, let's say, in appearance than the Florida on the other side. Now, here is the plan of the Willamette. And the plans are quite often compact. The one-story house, you see, it has more space than you would guess looking at the drawing. And you come in from the front porch there, and then you enter the living room, or you can go into the dining room. And there's a fireplace in the living room. Right. The dining room has, of course, the dining porch in the back, the breakfast nook, bag, whatever you call it, in the kitchen. And then on this side behind, there's a little passage there. Stairway leading down into the attic. And then on this side are two principal bedrooms and bathroom in between. Enter closet, box closet, and wood hoists, and sleeping porch on the back there, because this was a period when sleeping porches were considered absolutely essential. At this period, in the early part of this century, tuberculosis was quite a scourge in this country, although now it's almost been conquered completely, but it was, in the first 2 decades, still very much a hazard. And sleeping out in the open air was supposed to be good for your health. And of course, nearly all the older fraternity and sorority houses in Eugene had sleeping porches, as he said, closed in. And some, I suppose, are still in use. I'm not sure about that. Now, this is another design from the Fenner book, which is called the Santiam. Supposedly, I suppose you would have it on the Santiam River. They are not really distinguished architecturally, but the kind of a book that would be known by builders and by prospective clients. And it's what really gets the whole thing spread out. In fact, there are many other books, but this is just one of them. And that's called the Ogden on the left. You can't tell. I have to write it down. You can't guess whether that's Santiam or Ogden. There is no way of knowing. And one more, and that's called the Illinois. Well, very common type. There's a porch, then a compact mass, overhanging roof wall, sometimes carried out on brackets at the gable end, and a completely free disposition of the windows, no sense of formal order. They are presumably placed functionally, and that I think is true of the bungalow mass. Well, those are, that's the kind of thing, and those represent the kind of, well, we might say, median character of bungalow. There were, of course, fancier ones, and that's what you see there. One of the most elaborate and handsome is the Wilbur Reed House in Portland, and this was built about 1914 by a California architect named Francis Brown, and he was obviously familiar with the work of Green and Green. He's really very, very big. The heaviness of the timber work is characteristic of those Green, and of course it's rather smothered in vines and bushes. I think that perhaps more than they were expected to have at the beginning. But it's really it is perhaps the best example of a sort of Green and Green influenced bungalow in Oregon. Right next door to it is an older house that had been the house of Reed's parents, and this is what might be called really shingle style, maybe a Queen Anne shingle style. It's just next door to it. It's called Green Gables, but I don't have the date. This is 1914. That other probably dated from the 90s. Now in Eugene, we have lots of bungalows. In fact, they're all over the state. And I just taking a selection of them. This is a rather remarkable example because it is a double house. That is, it's two houses divided on a 45-degree angle where the two ways meet. This is the Schultz Westfall House on the corner of Pearl and 14th, about 1914-16. And with all of the bungalow characteristics that we come to see them, a big porch area, overhanging roof wall, brackets coming out of the gable end. There wouldn't be any support for them otherwise. And looking at the detail, you can see the freely disposed windows, and also something that comes to the view here, the fact that there are a lot of window boxes. So that was one of the things they like to do, is plant trailing vines and flowers and things in the window boxes. It's quite an interesting house. It's still standing, fortunately, and it is in quite good shape, too. It was the last time I saw it inside. A chimney in the center rose up and had provided a fireplace in each of those two sides. It's unusual to see a bungalow in the snow, but here it is. This is what we at one time when we had one of our rather heavy snowfalls. It's not a style of design for the snow, but it seems to work out as it does here. Now, I'll show you, I just a random sampling because I can't possibly show them all, and I really don't have any very good arrangement of data. This one is gone, but it was a house that I liked rather well, and it has some obvious features that are not apparent in all of them. This was in the 200 block on Broadway, West Broadway, 263. Demolished quite a while ago, and perhaps even the shaping of the beams that come out at the end to support the overhanging roof may also owe something to Japanese vernacular architecture. This is a very handsome, small house, and of course quite suitable. Well, let me show you. This is one in Bedford by Frank Clark, and he was the principal architect down there. They probably date both of these probably dates from the 20th. Because I don't think we have too many others of the period. This one, though, is not exactly, well, yes, it belongs to a bungalow style. This is a stage road inn, which is outside Jacksonville, built in 1916, and was a private residence, now become a restaurant and bar, at least when I took some photographs, which is overlooking the Road Valley and stands high up on the hill, and it's very nice. It had, I think, the Californian architect. I seem to have lost my specific note of that. The house was built for families in Homer and Livingston, and it's dated 1960. So you see, it does go back to the period of the development. And this is along the front, along the terrace. This would be at the end, as the bay window here. Again, the freedom of design with all these grouped window forms, bays projecting here and there, small windows. It is very typical of this American style of the beginning of the century, the first 2.5 decades in 1960. And there's the detail along the front with some of the bays. The bay above, the bay below, and they're all different. They're not. Now, just to take examples from Eugene, show you the ones that really look like some of the designs in the thinner book. This is on Pearl Street, and it's, I think, 1234. I showed it because it is quite simple, and yet it has considerable variety. And it has this sort of broken gable roof form over the porch. It's a very low segmental arch, if you want to call it that. And then it has, as you see, it also has some patterned brickwork, quite fancy brickwork in two colors of brick. Without being a very distinguished design, it is, of course, a finished building. And here is one which was on 13th, and it's been demolished. This building was built in 1923. I have a date for that. The other one was built supposedly in 1921. I said it was 1264 instead of 1234. Gave you the wrong number. But it's still there. This one on East 13th, 241, was demolished in 1981. A lot of houses have been demolished. Now here's a very simple, this is kind of getting down to the lowest common denominator of bungalows. This is the house here on Patterson, between 11 and 12. And here is the house in Portland, which is going to East Portland. That is a bungalow. And I picked this slide out to bring in because it shows where they're using a sort of river boulders, big pebbles to provide. They like that kind of space, and they like rather heavy posts, as it is to span across the two intermediate ones. But altogether, very typical bungalow in many ways. And here is the house on 11th corner of Hilliard Street. This is Newsom's house, her father's house, Schroeder House, now owned by the hospital, and therefore probably about to be demolished. Here is a big house in Portland, which is on Northwest 25th in Portland, and I think it's quite like the development of bungalow of the 2 stories and third attic above. It is, when I took the photograph, it was divided up into condominiums. And this is kind of thing, some of the houses are too big. Here's a curious house called, I found out the name of it is called Alpha Omega House. What that really means, I don't know. And it's on Kincaid Street, west or south rather, of 13th. I thought it's typical of these big barn-like things which are bungalow crafts combinations. And this is in Eugene. This is the on the corner of Mill and 13th. Typical. Not a bleak, not very attractive, and yet they're obviously not stylistically based on the past. Here is an example of a bungalow, shingle, which is in Salem, on the Willamette University campus. I think rather a good one. Oh yeah, good. How? It's better than this one. I think it's more G. Shingle. Quite frequently, the shingles are given a pattern of long, so short. It does have the intrinsic quality style, which not all of these have to get big. It's much bigger than the one you saw before there, which was a corner of Hilliard and 11. And here is a house I picked about here just to show you. This is in Coquille. You can't tell, but from the other, you can't tell where these houses would be located because they could be anywhere in the state. And it is again Spain shingle, very good for hang, and they like to bring this end board down and give it such a scallop pattern that's quite difficult. Now I'm going to show you just a few houses that don't really belong in the category which we've been following exactly, but they seem to fit here. I thought I had another bungalow coming out, maybe. Oh yeah, this is another bungalow. This bungalow I'm going to come back to is in Campbell, and it has a fixed up corner of the roof. That painted Japanese style. Of course, they're perched on a rather high hillside, so it doesn't help. But just to show you some related examples, not bungalows and, well, not craftsmen either, but very much of the period, and certainly not historically derived. This is a rather well-known house in Portland, the Burrell House of 1902 by Whitten and Lewis. And it's their one major excursion into something that suggests the Chicago School. It has just been nominated for the National Register. It has for many years been Holman's mortuary, and it is very well preserved inside. There's a big ballroom on the top floor, which is now used for the tasteful display of caskets. And that's very well kept. When we were considering this the other day, we were not shown that room. I mentioned people don't like to look at a room full of caskets, I get it. But I didn't mind it when I was there. I mean, used to that. And this is up in the corner. It has very wide overhang. And on the end of the top was some ornamental wrought iron brackets, which I doubt if they do any structural good, but add a great deal to the place we're looking at. Then, following that suggestion of the Chicago School, to show you this house by Venice, and the house next door to it, also by Venice, which are two houses getting us into the 20s. And this is the Madeley House. The other one was used by, what's her name, Faraday. I guess still Mr. Faraday lives in there, but his wife has gone off to get a degree at Harvard. Then they have the Chicago School at parts that separate them from the other. This is just a house, the same kind of thing, which is in Portland. Just to show you another example of this sort of Chicago School house, the Chicago School influence on it. Well, that may be pretty good. There's another one. You can find lots of big overhanging roofs. And if they're not bungalows in actual shape, they have bungalow characteristics. But it's also true that I would not hesitate to describe them as craftsman houses. And here is a surely craftsman house over here on 12th, and it was one time the Bay State Firehouse. It is now divided up into apartments, but it was a church. And it is practical. And all you need to do is to walk around the museum a little bit, and you see plenty of the big, square, craftsman houses, including this one-time fraternity, too. The ATO house, which is, I took the picture when it was in a derelict state, and it has been, of course, preserved, stored, and is used for offices down in Oak Street. This is a drawing by Louis Macomber for a house by the architect Doyle and Patterson for Henry Cabot in Portland. And here is another house in Portland, the oldest house, Iron House, which is another work for English craftsman style. This kind of thing led into something which is very special and which we have a few examples left. This is the house in Portland, and I show it because it has one of those imitation thatch roofs. English cottages frequently have thatch roofs, still do, but that is not as common in America, partly because I think you can't get the right kind of trees, especially the right thatch. But about the beginning of the second decade, that's 1910, 14, America invented this kind of shingling, which consisted of steaming shingle, small W-scale shingle, and putting them on over curvilinear corners to look like thatch at the edge. And that's what like that. That was quite popular, but because it's hard to maintain, when it does get spoiled, it doesn't last very much. In fact, we're getting into this kind of thing when it's been changed a good deal, and this here it is in a later example with a dreadful design, but quite this I call, this was the Fry House, apparently designed by the owner as late as 1930. And it has all kinds of quaint things. And some of it is spider-web windows. But here it is with this. This is a replacement of what was the shingle. The lunch is much nicer, but it's an asphalt shingle there now, and you can't really do that. I did have a slide of the house that showed the shingle route very well, south and west corner, but I can't for the life of me find it now. Trouble. Well, the English arts and crafts movement can be represented also by a few other buildings of the early 20s. This, of course, was a remarkable building designed by Professor Wilcox, built in 1922-23, the college side building on the corner of Kincaid and 13th. And it was originally built to house the cooperative store and a restaurant which was called the College Side Inn. And Mr. Wilcox had an office in it, and the bar in. It is directly related to Boise. And here is one of Boise's houses. This is a design for a house called Hogsback. And it was stucco. Actually, it was a great pity that we lost the college side. For a memorial, I lived in part of it for a time. Well, for some 17 years. That's enough to make it famous. Where I lived in had been before that Professor Wilcox's office. And it was there for that. It had been converted to an apartment. And the front part, which had originally been the cooperative store, had been converted to a restaurant, a remarkable restaurant there for many years. Here is another Boise design just to show you the general built the office, but it's certainly a good example of the English cottage style. So is this one, which is Dr. Overstreet's house on University Street, which is quaint as could be. It's about the corner of, 22nd. Well, anyway, that is the doctrine of that, all that. I'll show you an example of the same kind of thing in the East, which I know very well, the Blairmont Country Club at Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, and that is the period of the same architecture and the same English cottage craftsman type design. So, two houses by Purcell on Southwest Georgian Place, and then do these, and I'll maybe say some more about that another time. And here is another house on Southwest Vista by Purcell, who was a very distinguished architect of the Chicago School, who came to Oregon in the 20s, and it came in search of better health, but it didn't seem, he went then on to California, where in fact he lived for a very long time. Mr. Wilcox designed the former First Congregational Church on 13th, and it has maybe a touch of the Spanish, but basically I think, especially if you look at the adjacent building, it's very, very sweet. It's sort of arts and crafts movement. It was a memorial to Dr. Condon, in addition to being the First Congregational Church. It's now the Bijou Cinema. Well, they built another church, and it is a transition. And it is detailed in basically classical form. Of course, Galen was going to do a great Gothic detailed building in the Woolworth building, but that's coming later. Then you have this one, which is the American Bank building of 1913 by Doyle Patterson, and it is very similar to its general composition. What is it? Again, ground, a few floors of the ground treated as one, and then a continuous, simple, unbroken mass building, and then a couple of floors at the top, and terminating it with a fairly good-sized cornice. Looking up at it here, you can see it's a little bit washed out. I think it is not as pale in reality as it seems to be. But a handsome building. It's when this photograph was taken, there was that parking garage there, which is now the plaza, Pioneer Plaza. And before that, of course, was when the building went up, before the hotel was sitting right here in the way, and on the other corner across the street was Marion Frank. This kind of building to be seen since the second decade of the century. This is the finished building of 1914 by Doyle and Patterson, the same people who did the American Bank building. Doyle was generally considered to have been the person who designed these, but it's all possible to himself. This was not all built at one time. It was built up to a certain point and then added to later. 1913 is also the date of the Jackson Tower building, which was originally the Oregon Journal building. And you can see that it is instead of brick, the others have been brick, that's faced terracotta, white or cream colored, very light cream colored terracotta. And this was to be both popular and I think quite successful surface treatment. Actually, the architects were Reed and Reed, R-E-I-D, and Reed, R-E-I-D, of San Francisco, who was going up right at the same time as the American Bank building. It's a period in which the good many of these buildings were going up. This is the former Lipton Wolf building. I'm not sure there's anything in it now, but it has gone through different hands. It was, of course, one of the major department store buildings, and it was built in 1909, a little bit earlier, by Doyle, and it is a terracotta-covered building. The cream-colored terracotta became almost standard for building. It's very suitable, covering a steel frame, of course, the structure is a steel frame. And then Marion Frank, right on the next block from the Lipton Wolf building. The Marion Frank building went through a number of different sections. Part of it was built in 1910 to 12, and it was further extended in 1914 to 15. And the architects were Doyle and Patterson. It's fairly successful in combining different sections, but it is a kind of ponderous building, and maybe it's a little bit of top heavy in the back end. It just doesn't come off in a simple, direct way that one would, that I think the Wolf did, you know. Well, the other department store was built Old Woodman King, and that was the Galleria now. I don't have a slide of that. I couldn't find it, I guess. I had some somewhere. That was built about the same time, and they moved from their 6th Avenue building, which is, as you can see, the last time we exchanged buildings. This is another view of mine with Frank. I believe this corner is later than the other one. This is the southwest corner. Later than the southeast corner. Well, then, a detail of it, there is ornament on this. Most of these buildings do have a certain amount of ornament in the terracotta. The little details on the stained glasses, and also a little detail around the window groupings, as you can see. On the whole, it's not very obtrusive, and when you look at the building from a little distance, you hardly see that, so it is quite simple. But later generation of modern architects would disapprove of that kind of decoration, that kind of treatment. And I think now we have reached the point where we can take it or leave it. Well, it's very hard to know when to stop saying this stuff is progressive American architecture, and it really is what I like to think of as period architecture. Period. And perhaps this is a good place to mention that. And yet, it's practically the same time as the last example. This one is the First National Bank building, their old building, which was finished in 1960. And the architects were Coolidge and Carlson, a firm of architects in Boston, who were actually a sort of descendant of Henry Hobson Richardson's firm. It is clearly designed with recognizable Greek and quite reasonably correct. It's quite definitely a good example of Greek Doric portico. The portico is recessed, and the building, there couldn't have been anything quite like that in ancient Greece, and rising up above the top kind of elaborated attic. Perhaps the general form of it is in fact somewhat more suggestive of Roman period of architecture than Greek. But this one is worth noting because it was done by a Boston firm. Boston was one of the centers of architectural development in this part of the century. Well, we can compare that with a building that dates from almost exactly the same time, and that is the U.S. National Bank building, the United States National Bank building, this old main building. And it still is used by the United States National Bank, whereas the first interstate had moved away. Fortunately, they haven't managed to tear down that roof. This, I think it has been generally better liked, but that might be because it was designed by Doyle, A. Doyle, and it was built in 1917, and perhaps a year or two later. And some parts on the west side were actually in the 20s. And here, this is obviously, well, it could be American Renaissance, but we're into the period architecture, and they consciously wanted to be Roman, imperial Roman, and it has a very handsome Roman Corinthian order. It is terracotta. The other one is marble. This one is the first one. This is terracotta. And it's beautifully designed order. And very close to the original Roman order. Had a nice big banquet hall in the center, several stories high, and then later on it was continued on the west side, really just about half a block. And Portland blocks are small. What are they about 200 feet square. Very small, but that's a number of towns in Eugene have this small block. Here's our building we've seen the last time, the Wells Fargo building by Benjamin Mr. Morris, and which is, of course, now part of the complex that is controlled by the U.S. National Bank. Well, I don't want to be too disparaging, but we look at the other one a moment again, and I think that really Doyle's building is perhaps more satisfactory. The Greek Doric is pretty hard to handle in a building like this. This is contemporary, of course, with the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, and comes off better in a building like the Lincoln Memorial, of course. Here is another view of the Doyle building, and you see the Wells Fargo building rising up to the side of it, which had been done a few years earlier, about, in fact, 10 years earlier. But the time it started, the time it was finished. And that is, I think, perhaps, was the best example of the interpretation of the Roman period architecture that one has. It isn't quite as original as maybe most people in Portland think. And it's no shame, I guess, But here is another bank, the Bank of California in San Francisco, which is stone colored, and the same order. It was designed by Professor Leland, very well-known firm of architects in San Francisco, and this is done in 1908. So you see, it's about 9 years earlier than the Portland building. And I know, of course, that Mr. Doyle certainly knew this building, and it's hard to say if we could put them together. There's construction going on there in addition to it when I took that picture. It's rather colder. The terracotta, of course, is perhaps warmer, more sympathetic. This is pretty icy, and it's hemmed in by tall buildings so it doesn't get a lot of sun. But that is the same kind of idea of trying to do Roman. Now, Roman temple forms, and it is based ultimately on a temple, and Greek temple forms are not so unlikely as you might suppose, because in ancient times, when there weren't any banks like today, the temples were, in fact, repositories of valuables, and they did receive goods and money and lent money from temples in ancient times. So it's not quite as outlandish to use Roman temple-like ones as some people think. In fact, they're very handsome to make it that way. There is the U.S. Bank again. This is a view on the west side, looking along the west side of it. It was repeated at this date from the 20th. At about the same time, the public library, the Multnomah County Library, was built, also by Doyle, and 1913. And this building has generally been praised very highly and liked very much, and I see no reason why it shouldn't be. And then we say, what is it? What style is it? Because I think in this period, in these years, they wanted the building to have a recognizable style. It is basically, in my opinion, a kind of Georgian example. But it's not completely like any Georgian building in England or in the eastern United States. It's a very handsome building, a big rectangular block, and a fine portal there for ground, some nice reading rooms inside. That is the Multnomah County Library. And here, I think, a detail of the port entrance, because it's very well done. And Doyle and his office were good at this sort of thing. Handsomely detailed, and I think, even though it's 1913, and I think mostly period architecture, the 20th period architecture, rather than, say, somewhere along there there's a thin line, and when we let the American architecture and look now at this exterior example. Well, this is this is anyway. I have to look at it again. One of these buildings, I forget what this one is.
Roseburg?
Oh, I think it is. Mr. Roseburg.
Well, we use that sign that says drugs in one of our publications.
Roseburg? Good. Yes. It's Roseburg, all right, I guess. And it is, in fact, a public building, federal building, I think. It's not particularly good, but there. And this one is it's arranged in a general way, but rather specifically sort of Spanish Renaissance. In Spanish Renaissance parts, because there never was a Spanish Renaissance building like this. This is the Sonic Temple in Salem, and it dates about 1913 too, and it was designed by Elvis. Well, of course, all this stuff is fashionable today, but it has that kind of treatment. The top in terracotta, with this brickwork for the rest of it, and patterned brick, and then a rather wide overhanging cornice at the top. That's very Mediterranean, and I think it's a very handsome building. I could only regret the fact that you have this fashion for awnings, fixed awnings like this, has swept over the whole thing and has gone much too far, I think. If it should be destroyed. I'm waiting for them to get burned up. Here is a detail looking at, now you see without the very awning. And I think this is one of the good examples of this. And that's, I suppose we thought of it as Spanish Renaissance. It's later on, it was because, Spanish colonial, but not I think here. This is going right back to the Renaissance, that is to the 16th century in Spain, very large. But it's a very, very handsome building of the sort. Large buildings frequently have an important example of this flag. 1912 is the date I would give this, and it is by Lawrence Holden. This is the large, sonic lodge in the Dow, the Elvis building, not the Masons, and it's in the Dow at about the same time. And not as good, really, but at that, I suppose they thought that was what? Georgia. That would be like that. The Elks Lodge in Portland, or the former Elks Lodge, no longer used by them, is perhaps the masterpiece of this sort of thing. And this one is dated 1920, and it is based on very specific Italian Renaissance example. It's based on the part of Palazzo Farnese in Rome. And it's this very nice, elegant detail. It was done by the architects Otali and Dugan, which is really a handsome building. I think I brought it up there. Because when you look at just the framing of the windows, and they are very Roman in character, all the Palazzo Farnese, some of these, and perhaps this is a little bit more like the Palazzo Massimo in Rome. But altogether, it is the Roman high Renaissance. And clearly, that's what they were looking through in the books. Illustrations in art, and to get it to come out like that. It's perhaps the best example, one that's really strictly sort of Italian Roman high Renaissance that we have in the state of Orient. This little building is in Salem, and it's another Elks building, and it is the Elks Lodge, I think it still is, of 1924, but they were not, by Knighton and Hubbard, which says people were not responsible for this dreadful porch. And since I just happened to see this again a few days ago, it just horrified me that anybody could do that. It's very nice, restrained, Renaissance, again, Italian-made building. Oh, there, this was put up since World War II, and it just ruins everything. I'm told the Elks are going to abandon it because they know there's not enough parking, and they need more parking for their numerous followers, and the fact that they usually have a considerable amount of, well, bar and even limited gambling in their spots. So they're going to move outside instead of town. Sometimes they haven't done it yet, but they're going to. It's just like this last Friday when I it was the last time recorded. It was done in 1924, and then, of course, during the 20s, that would be perfectly possible to use that Renaissance design. I suppose I should put this in with that, too. This is the State Hospital by Edgar Lazarus, and it had a certain notoriety in recent years because of the murder of Mr. Franklin near the entrance to it. But it is actually a little bit earlier, 1913 or so, rather than 1920. Well, period architecture can have other styles than Renaissance, Georgian, or whatever. This is the Elsinore Theater in Salem. And, well, I suppose now people would hesitate to take down this sign because it is rather a good example of sort of Art Deco. But as you see, it's designed in a kind of Gothic way. The inside isn't Gothic. The inside is rather more Renaissance, so to speak. And it was designed by Lawrence, his firm, Lawrence of Holford, as a project. There's been a considerable effort to save the theater, and I think it has been preserved. Not a bad example. One of the better examples of the elaborate type of theater that was built in the 20s, which is the exponent of the 20s, and like some of the others in Portland, that I don't have time to show to you. That this is another building of about the beginning of the second decade of the century. This is the police headquarters in Portland, and the architects were Emil Schock and Son. And they're not so well known as they should be. And this I would say, like the Portland Public Library, that I call it the Multnomah County Library, is a George. Red brick, stone, very restrained in many ways, Georgian detail. Quite a handsome building. And it is now put on the national register, as some of the others have too. It's quite good. Well, just to show you this cornerstone, which gives you the information. Police headquarters, erected in 1912. The mayor was somebody named Rushlight, and Emil Schock and Son, architect. It's too bad that not all buildings are marked as well as this. The Freiburg Construction Company builders, and then I think this says the East Portland Wire and Ironwork, so we even never did this plaque. That's I did that. Benefit of historians is buildings should always be identified that way. I'm going to switch horses now. Carousel. So the ladies, there we go around horses. I believe that get the other one. I think maybe you left the left and the right, but it doesn't matter. We'll go through it. So that's all right. Okay. Let me settle down there so I can go look. Here we're looking at another type of building. I'll show you a few examples that belong to this period of architecture. The one on the left is well known to all of you, I'm sure. It's the Denson Hotel in Portland. And the one on the right is a better known hotel, although maybe not all of you know it as well. It's the Bellevue Stratford in Philadelphia. And bigger. But at the beginning of the century, there was a decided taste for using this sort of man-started, Frenchified design for building hotels in particular, and some of the very most important buildings in America at that period, hotel buildings, were like that. For instance, the Wilbur Hotel, New Willard, as it's called then, in Washington, was the one. again, all that great piled up roof form, and frequently had rather narrow roof garden. It was a very roof garden. And when I was small, I never saw that from this one. I did see a number of times they had the building graphic, and I loved to be just taken up the roof garden for his dinner in the evening. And then he said, the building the Doyle again over there, and Doyle for the tell me whether the law was placed here, but anyway, I'll find it. Doyle Patterson and Beach, 1912-13, and this in Philadelphia was done by G.W. and W.D. Hewitt in 1900, a decade apart. And I think this is quite satisfactory. Well, something mixed up again, I guess. Yeah. I'm going to take this back. There is the Benson Hotel, a more recent photograph, and you see an addition to the south side of it, about doubling the size of the original hotel, but not being so architecturally satisfactory. But it is. Well, then, this hotel in Portland, the Governor, formerly known as the Stewart Hotel, is really an unusual building. Anyway, built about 1912 to 14, the same period that many of these buildings, and the architect for that was Mr. Knight, William C. Knight, who was, in fact, the architect of Johnson Hall and of the State Supreme Court building in the Salem. But it's not like that. It's more unusual. In fact, hard to classify its style, its stylistic terms. I can't even say what. It has some suggestions of some of the more, odd example of Chicago School. But I also think it has some suggestions of certain kinds of English arts and crafts. And although I don't have a slide to bring into that, when you look at the entranceway, you do see around there is some tile work in there, under the deep shade, that's decidedly suggestive of some of the designs of Frank Lloyd Wright. So this maybe should be classified as progressive American architecture. I don't think any tall building, this isn't very tall, had quite that kind of treatment. And this should be a detail of looking up. Chunky, curious design, these sorts of dripping patterns. Well, here is a little bit of the tile. And there's some tile on the foot. No, that's it. As you see, that it has, this is obviously terracotta. There is a certain taste for this kind of curious, somewhat bell-shaped profile as you do to the building. And the windows, even like this, belong more or less to the Chicago School. The narrow double-hung window and the larger central window, which is sometimes pivoted, sometimes fixed. But I think it's it is one of the more exotic examples of the period. And it sort of puts this other hotel, which is larger, and at the same time puts it to shade. And this is the most known hotel of about the same time by an architect named Gibson and Cahill. That's information I got from Crowley. And Crowley liked that kind of thing, but this would be his progressive American architecture. It has some other interesting features. It is a big block-filling structure, and it has a number of balconies, and it also has this sort of jewel-studded ornament. And I believe that if you study that, you'll find and look at the remains, some of them are gone, that under those glass bulbs there were lights. So this hotel would have had a twinkling effect of light when it was here. I never saw it like that, so it business like this. It is more or less humdrum, certainly humdrum compared to the other example which we saw, but at any rate, worth noting as we go along. Now, just a couple other hotels which are curious, but which are much more provincial. And this one is the Pendleton Hotel. Well, there's another slide into that again. This is the Pendleton Hotel on the left, and this is the Union Hotel on the right, and the Pendleton Hotel is dated 1914, and this one is dated 1919. And this is Georgian, his general character. And this, perhaps, just took this strange, maybe little touch of kind of imitating medieval. On the other hand, it could be considered, perhaps, as an approach to modern, though it's not very clear that can be proved. This is more likely to have, and of course, one wonders about the kind of comfort of the hotel. A number of them were built around the state like this. The old Osborne Hotel in Eugene was somewhat like that, in general form. And the recently demolished Hotel Medford in Medford was rather like that, a little bit more obvious than Georgia. And just after it was put on the National Register, it was demolished. Accidental fire and destroyed the Medford Hotel. I think these two are still standing, though I wouldn't like to personalize that one. This is the Arlington Club, Gentlemen's Club in Portland, two views of it. And it is the really handsome building by William Lewis in 1909. But it lacks something. But it is supposed to be Georgian, I think. Well, it's about the same time as the Montgomery County Library. And it's a very extravagant at all. There were rooms with little bathrooms. They had these curious little grills so that you can open the window, utility window. And the base of it has, it stands at the end of the south park block that was sort of rusticated into brick pattern, and then group windows. So it, I suppose, could equally well be called progressive American architecture. Then there is the University Club, which isn't very far from it, and which is obviously Roth. Now, there can be no doubt that we have to say this is period architecture. It is not progressive American architecture. The University Club was designed by White House and Fuyou. And I personally think that it was probably designed by Andre Fuyou, but not everybody would agree with me on that. I have felt rather dubious about attributing a great many buildings to Mr. Whitehouse, who was a very prominent architect over a long period of time. And it seems to me that sometimes he must have been using his office. I was arguing against his attribution last week at Taylor. Then I was told, well, I'm probably wrong. But I do think this is by Fuyou. Now, Fuyou is an interesting person in the history of American art. He was French, and of course he was trained in the École de Roth, and he came to Portland and was associated with the White House. And then, soon after this was built, which was built in 1913, the First World War started. And Fuyou went back to France and to help his country to that period. Kuyu was in effect. When Hood died, Kuyu continued to live for quite a while. And I wish we knew more about him. I don't think there's much to say about it. And there must be quite a bit that could be discovered, especially in New York. Well, that's the University of London. And here is a building that is similar in general character, what is that? Gothic lake, if you like. And this is the University, almost the same gate, really. That's Control 13. And this is Elliott Hall at Green College. Now, this is designed by Doyle. Well, it goes to the idea that the general choice of it was probably inspired by buildings, this is the late English medieval, maybe just better as a coined term from the Bismarck Company. Going back perhaps as became a rather popular form of academic buildings, and its it probably was started at the University of Pennsylvania by Furness and Hewitt in some buildings they did in the 90s. And although you may not be able to see it quite once, I think that actually Friendly Hall was meant to be somewhat in the same general category. It's been altered a good deal, and you can't tell what it was. Well, now I have a few churches to throw in here. Most of it's garbage, and we look at those. Some of them are very odd indeed. This one on the right is a former Episcopal church in the Downs. I believe it's no longer used as a church, but as a meeting place. And then on the left is a curious little building, a synagogue, which I think is still standing, but I'm not sure whether it's far. I believe that she thought maybe it was destroyed. It's a park block, maybe some of you know. In Portland, it is a synagogue. And it is, this of course is inspired by the Gothic. And that one went on. And this is the design of Edgar Lazarus, which apparently was one of the congregations of this synagogue. As you see. It just says youth center there. So perhaps the synagogue is probably moved away. The congregation of the synagogue. But anyway, I'm curious example. It is wood, and this is a little hard to try. Not quite so easy to suggest as is the case. Now here's another building in the Dalles, and this is a Catholic church. And I think that this is still a Catholic church. And this one was in St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church. I believe it may be also, although now that I think it could be some other years, built 1897 to 99, and consisted by a local builder. This is a Herbert, supposedly based on a German design by a man named Herr Rinkler of München, and it was obviously quite Germanic looking. It's like a northern German Gothic type church. Pretty well done, and it even has some but it has an interior of it. Yeah, rather nice interior with some decoration that's typical of this period. Now, very similar in character is this church, which is also a Roman Catholic church, and it is in the town of Mount Amos. It's at the foot of the hill, on top of which is the Abbey, Benedictine Abbey. Now this is dated about 1910 onward, the cornerstone and it is said to be by Otto Clemson. And we did maybe the Dallas Church. Very similar to other characters, but there is one very curious feature about it. There's a tower shape similar to Bucky's Point, and it's a brick. But the brick here, a little like cast concrete brick. I consider it a cast concrete brick, to argue about. And it gives you this funny effect that it's sort of being quilted over when you look at it. There actually is, you know, the concrete block which we see in other places with the rock face are usually bigger, and these are just brick style. And it's quite a handsome church. It takes a little while to get over that seasoning, but nonetheless, it is an impressive church, and I have an interior. It has also quite a bit of rather interesting sort of decorative painting on the walls inside. You don't come out there on the photograph. As you said, it is the silicon plan with the central main aisle, and you just can't get the right effect of that central painted decoration. But it's very greatly in contrast, of course, to the Abbey Church up on the hill. Here is a long gone church. Well, not so very long gone, because I took these pictures. This is the First Presbyterian Church in Eugene, which is at the corner of Pearl and 10th. And what's there today is a parking lot. As it is said, this is the church. It was shingled here, but it originally, I'm told, had been stone faced. But the stone didn't last, didn't wear well. And so it was removed about 10 years after it was built. And this is the detail of the church of one of the stained glass windows. It was built about 1910, and then the stone was removed about 10 years later, about 1980. When they moved their church to the one that is presently serving as the Central Presbyterian Church over here on the 15th Street, they took some of the windows and they are incorporated into that other building. And that building, of course, is post-World War II. Well, this was still there and still serving at that time later. Most interesting and most perhaps impressive of the churches around the beginning of the century, well, the second decade, is this church in Portland, which is Westminster Presbyterian Church, designed by Elvis Lawrence. And there on the left, right, is a church which I think he may have had in mind when he was doing it. And this is a church in Roker, R-O-K-E-R, in northern England, by the architect Fry, who did the house that we saw the next time. I used to say just a general master of it. And this kind of rich interior in both cases. The last don't have slides of the inside of this one. I do have a couple of the Friars Church, which you'll see, and in which case there's very nice woodwork and colored glass of a rather, I think, dramatic kind here. This is a detail of Roker, and there is another view of Westminster Presbyterian Church, which has some additions beyond this of Sunday school and so forth. There's a detailed window, the main window, which is at the entrance end. It's not correctly oriented, well, it would be the west end of the church. There is quite a similar feeling between this church of Roker and this one. As I said, it's probably the best example of this kind of scholarly Gothic that we have in Oregon, as it's not very many of them, to tell you the truth, around. And the Roker Church is dated 1907, and Lawrence's Church is dated
1912 to 14. So they're just about right amount of time to get between them. Here is an interior of the church at Roth, which has stone vaulting, but for the church does not. And this has another view of it, showing you some of the lavish woodwork by Ernest Gilson, who was one of the Cotswold craftsmen. This is the church. This is the Roth Church in the north of England. I wish I had some slides of the interior of Westminster, and maybe the school, but they didn't get around to looking. Well, here's the curious little church that is also the Dark by Loris, and is in the grant of 1924, but it is an Episcopal church, part of the Episcopal, and a curious little church. It's not perhaps so quickly Gothic, but very definitely in the spirit. I think the arts and crafts spirit, the prior wouldn't have objected to seeing that. Well then, in the 1920s, you do get quite a lot of Highland church. And there, I'm showing you some because you'll run into this quite often. But I think that on the whole, they're not really good. There is the first Christian church in Portland. And there's the cornerstone was dated in 1922. Architect, and it's kind of a Highland style move. It's kind of really rather awful building in a way. And then there were a number of churches that are really sort of domestic life. And these are represented by such examples as this one, which is the Christian Science Church in Rothsburg. And here is a similar design, almost identical really, perhaps it really is identical, of the former Christian Science Church in Ashland, which is now incorporated into the whole theater complex. They use it as a recital or practice hall. And I just said that either of those two they're nice, but they're not particularly. Rothsburg is dated 1928, and I suppose this one is about in the later 20s. Little sort of domestic kind of architecture, and there used to be a church of somewhat similar character here before the present Christian Science Church was built in 1948. And here is the first Christian church in Rothsburg of 1928. Now, there again is hybrid and not very distinct. And I return to this church, which is distinctly as impressive, and we right very clearly into the way in which an architect could select a period, probably with the advice of the congregation, and do a church. This is the first Unitarian church in Portland by Jameson Parker, and it was done in 1925. Now that is a very competent, distinguished design, and nobody can complain about what, the lack of knowledge is quite different from what those other churches we just been looking at. 1925, the cornerstone has dated 21 June 1925, and Jameson Parker was one of the most sophisticated of Portland architects in the 20s. But to make and it is obviously based on colonial American churches, New England type, or maybe Virginia, and that's nice interior too. Not a very big building. These enhance the appearance of it. When you look at it from a distance, you'll see that it's really almost like a toy church. I don't like to stress that, but it's true. It seems rather small for an important church on 12th Avenue. But you have this kind of thing, which is the same period, 1926, and which is the First Baptist Church in Eugene. And there is a decent example of the Georgian meeting house type, but not very distinguished, wasn't done by distinguished architects. Jameson Parker, however, in 1925, the same time he did the Presbyterian Church, did this church, this Episcopal Church, which is St. Mark's, yes. St. Mark's Episcopal Church, a beautiful rendering here, you see, of it. And there's a photograph of it aside. It was intended to be a rather hard Episcopal church, and it was thought to have been influenced by a 19th century example in Philadelphia. Well, it does have some interesting stained glass. It also has some painted decorations inside. Wilbur, when we used to take a tour, we'd always go there as well as to these others. And it's based on North Italian Romanesque. He could do North Italian Romanesque at the same time he could do the New England colonial factor in the same year. And both of them are common. Now that is what happens to architecture in America. By the 20s, architects were trained in schools, and they learned this style, and they learned how to do buildings in various styles, and that is, of course, what you see here. St. Mary's Catholic Church here in Eugene is almost contemporary, added by Dinkelberger, and Joseph Jacob Dinkelberger, I believe, 1927. It was dedicated on the 12th of October, 1927. He was a portrait architect. Well, he was a very prolific architect, and a family of prolific architects, and it doesn't have it in it. There's no doubt that what Jameson Parker was a more sophisticated mind than most of the architects. Perfectly all right, but this is, you may think it's too bleak, it's there, but, and it was true that there were other churches being built in this period in the eastern part of the country in this sort of Italian, North Italian Romanesque. It's not like the Romanesque revival, it's not like the Richardsonian Romanesque, it's literally knowledge from reproductions and books about the North Italian Romanesque. This is Gothic, of course, and satisfactory but not very great. To finish this off, here is a little Christian Science church in the Dalles, the Dalles, yes. And it could be as late as 1930, and it is really rather like, it's also, in a way, Romanesque, North Italian Romanesque. I think it is corporal label up here at the top. And this is really a kind of more Renaissance. Well, you run the gamut. You can have, that's what the period is, but I mean the period architecture, when you can have all those things as you want. And I just got that out of some way. That's St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Eugene, and that's where we stop today.